Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books, and I hope you're having a fantastic week. First of all, I've got a little bit of an apology to make. This is my summary for October, and I appreciate we're already partway through November, so running a little bit late. It's been a bit of a chaotic month or so I've not got so much to share with you either, which I also apologise for. But what I have read is five really interesting books and diverse books, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you. And as I say, the good news also is I set myself a challenge at the beginning of the year to read at least 100 books in 2023, and I've smashed that. I've really gone further, gone over and above. So I'm not so worried from that point of view, but I do feel like I've sort of not hit a slump, but normally I devour literature a lot more quickly than I have been doing. So I'm hoping that I find something that really gets me back into the rhythm of it. But the books I've read are all interesting ones, and I'm looking forward to sharing them with you. And they're all, well, most of them are quite recent. There's one that's a little bit older, but they also sort of fit in really nicely with the fall and the colder, darker evenings, and curling up and reading a book. And I think I've droned on enough about how I love sort of gothic and historical novels this time of the year, and they sort of fit with that as well. But the first book I wanted to talk about, you'll know, you probably would have guessed, as I've talked a lot about how Shirley Jackson is one of my absolute favourite writers. The Haunting of Hill House is one of the books I pick up and reread again and again, and We've Always Lived in the Castle. If you've never read any Shirley Jackson, do read either of those. Start with one of them, and also her short story The Lottery, which you can find online quite easily now, which is just disturbing and amazing. So I absolutely love Shirley Jackson. So recently I found out that this was coming out, and it's called A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand. So I've never read anything by, or I hadn't read anything by Elizabeth Hand before I picked this up, but apparently it was sort of, she was approached by the Shirley Jackson Foundation, who asked her to write this novel. And I thought, because of that, I felt like, in a pair of safe hands in terms of continuing the tradition. And what she does is she takes us back to Hill House, which is exciting, but in a modern day context. And there are some really nice hints and connections with the original text. So the introduction is very much like inspired by the introduction of Shirley Jackson's book. The building itself, there's a sense of disorientation and space moving around, which I think Shirley Jackson did so well. And obviously, the central themes and things are there, and they're very similar. There's also a nice little nod at one point to the ending of the original novel, which I won't say just in case you haven't read A Haunting of Hill House. So I absolutely, went to the shop and just sort of said, take my money, I want to read it now. And so that's how I ended up with it. And it's the first book I read of the month. It actually took me a while to read, but not because I didn't enjoy it. I just, for some reason, kept putting it down and picking it up again. So the premise is Holly, who's a playwright, and her partner Nisa, who's a singer-songwriter, they travel to Hill House, which Holly actually came across accidentally in the first part of the book, and they spontaneously decide to hire it for 2 weeks while they work on their new musical venture. So this is a play about a witch called Elizabeth Sawyer, and it's full of songs that have been adapted from murder ballads as well. So it's sort of got a folky feel to it, and they're really thinking that the place is going to be really inspiring. It isn't just the two of them. There are a couple more people who come along as well to work on the play and do all the read throughs. One is Amanda Greer, who is an actress, a seasoned actress, but has a kind of had a bit of a fall from grace, a fall from the limelight, and she's playing the lead role of the witch. And then we also have Stevie, who's a long-term friend of Nisa and Holly. He's had a bit of an issue with drugs in the background, but he's sort of clean and wanted to work, and he's an actor as well as lots of other things as well. So essentially the four characters that go to stay in this gigantic crumbling mansion in the middle of nowhere. And another thing that is quite prevalent from the beginning is the sort of distortion of time, as well as a distortion of space, and they find that time passes really oddly at Hill House. while they're there, they rented the house from a local estate agent called Ainslie, who actually owns the house. They are looked after by Ainslie's sister, Melissa, who is the housekeeper, and her husband who cooks food for them. And then there's a third sister who lives on the grounds of Hill House and kind of keeps an eye on the events as they unfold. The one thing I found a little bit frustrating in the form of the book is because it's told through the different points of views of the characters, and it jumps from one character to the other. But you often find with books where that happens, there's a clear indication of who it is who's taken the helm, who is it that's telling us the story at this point, and that doesn't happen here. So sometimes sometimes it's clear straight away. Sometimes I just gave me a bit of a moment where I'm just trying to think, where am I, and who is now taking over the story. So that not frustrated me. I mean, in some ways it works really well with this idea of disorientation and not quite knowing where you are, which is very much part of the book. But in terms of clarity, I found it threw me a little bit at times. But it was an enjoyable read. It's got huge shoes to fill. You know, it doesn't have that sort of 50s panache and style that Jackson has in her telling of The Haunting of Hill House. It does feel very modern, which isn't a problem, but you can see where Elizabeth Hand has worked really hard to try and build these connections in, and she's clearly done a lot of research, and there's a lot of thought gone into the book. It's not my favourite book I've ever read, but if you are a lover of Shirley Jackson, I think it's worth picking up for curiosity as much as anything. And there are some good page turning elements as the book goes on, and all of the characters have secrets, all the best characters have, so there's certainly enough to keep me reading, and I enjoyed it generally. It doesn't have the nuance of the original either. It's a little bit more in your face, but yeah, I enjoyed it. And it made me curious to read other work that Elizabeth Hand has written, because she's won loads of awards. I can understand by reading the blurb why she was approached to write this book based in Shirley Jackson's world. So one of the other books I actually read this week off the back of this month, is Wylding Hall, which is one of her earlier novels. And this one I really did enjoy. It's a really short read. It's only like 140 odd pages, and it was published in 2015. It was quite difficult to get a hold of, actually, but I'd heard good things about this book on other channels. I think it was the lovely Willow from Books and Bow who'd mentioned it to me originally, and I thought, yeah, that sounds right up my street. So I'm really pleased that I've read it, and I actually much prefer this to her more recent work, but they both, you know, have plenty of merit to them. But this one is quite different. In some regards, there are similarities. It's a British folk band in the 1970s, or the beginning of the 1970s. They're called Wind Hollow Fair, and they're looking for somewhere to work on their difficult second album. So they go to Wylding Hall, and their manager rents it out for them for the summer, where they can work together and write some new material. So you've got the whole band that are available. We've got two lead singers. We've got Julian and Leslie. Leslie's only 17. She's sort of but a very sparky character. They're all really young. Julian is the other lead singer. He's sort of quite enigmatic and mysterious in terms of personality. Then we've got John, Will, Ashton, and they're all sort of other parts of the band. So there's a whole cast of characters. But what's really interesting about the story is it reminded me of Daisy and the Six. If anybody's read Daisy and the Six, where the story is told through different voices, this is what happens here. The story is passed from character to character as they look back on the events that took place that summer in Wylding Hall. So it was quite gradual, really, because you're repeating little bits of information, but through the eyes of a different character. But it sort of slowly builds, and there's this real sense of the uncanny and the strange about this location. And I found it a lot more nuanced, and yeah, just genuinely creepy, actually. I really enjoyed it, but it definitely reminded me of Daisy and the Six as well, in the way the story is told. So I would definitely recommend it. It's very short. If you can get hold of a copy, she's really excellent at showing overtelling. She just creates this really fantastically creepy atmosphere, and I found that the ending was also really satisfying. So yeah, I'm really glad that I read A Haunting on the Hill, which I enjoyed anyway, and I'd really love to know if what other people thought of that. But for the main reason that it brought me to Wylding Hall, which I enjoyed, really enjoyed, I thought this would be a firm recommendation to anybody who loves the Gothic genre. I think probably you'll enjoy this book. Right, so a bit of history now, and this is another book that I picked up, and it's The Glutton by A.K.Blakemore, and this was another one that's come out this year. I was kind of intrigued by this because I'd previously heard about the historical character that the book was based on. So when I saw the book come out and realised it was about the same real life character, it immediately made me want to read it and find out more. It's written by A.K.Blakemore, who wrote The Manningtree Witches, and likewise I've actually purchased The Manningtree Witches, which I hadn't read, off the strength of The Glutton, which is a really fabulous historical novel. It's really, really interesting. The book starts at the beginning with this character who's called the Great Terrar. His name is Terrar, and apologies anybody who's French, that pronunciation might be terrible. He was named after the village where he was brought up, where he was born. And we begin at his deathbed, and he's looking back at the events of his life and telling them to a nun who is nursing him. And as well as this really interesting historical tale that draws on the real life events related to somebody from the past, there's also lots of questions that the book raised about what makes a monster and how celebrity, makes a monster, and we have very sort of complex feelings about the character throughout. Really, we kind of feel a certain amount of loyalty to him, I think, because we know about him his entire life. We go along that whole journey with him. It's very difficult to see him as a true monster. And yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. And not only is the historical aspect, it's based in France, I think I want to say 18th century, but off the top of my head I can't remember. I want to say it's that sort of a time period. It's actually leading up till, oh yeah, it begins and ends. It ends right at the end of the 18th century as the French Revolution is taking place. So he sort of lives through all of that time period as well, which is quite interesting. It's sort of going on in the background. It's interesting to see how that affects his life. So really interesting time period to be exploring anyway. And I was really, really blown away by the research, the detail, and the care that had gone into the writing of this book, and also the sort of some really beautiful lyrical descriptions as well throughout it. It's not just an interesting story, it's just really beautifully written as well. And there's some really fantastic poetic passages where we're learning more about Terrar, and none of the dialogue is in speech marks, but that wasn't an issue. I found it very easy to follow and to know who was saying what. But yeah, I would definitely recommend by this. So I was really sort of blown away from it. I've not read a really, really good historical fiction novel for a long time. And as I say, it was one of those things that the story of this character drew me on and made me turn the page and kept me reading. And this was certainly one of the most page turning books I've read for a while. But afterwards, I continue to think about it. I continue to think about the questions that it poses. So it's one that sort of stayed with me. So it'd be interesting to know what other people think about that, or whether you've read The Manningtree Witches as well, and whether you think I need to prioritise that as one of my next reads. So that's The Glutton. The next one I read is another weird dark book, and this is one that I've had on my shelf for a while but I hadn't got around to, and it's the 2022 Motherthing. And this is written by Ainslie, Hogarth, and I again really, really enjoyed this. It's exactly the sort of thing I love, a strange weird book, but really compelling, really well written, a good page turner. Again, made me ask some really interesting questions about relationships, made me genuinely anxious at times reading this book. The end is is not what I expected, and I quite like the fact it wasn't what I expected, but there's a real sense of tension, and the story is told through the eyes of Abby, who is talking about her life. She and her husband have moved to his mother's house to get care for her. She has a lot of really serious mental health issues, and at the beginning of the book she passes away, and in a moment of not really sure what she's doing, Abby takes her ring off her finger, off her mother-in-law's finger, and that is kind of it's like the heart in the telltale heart is there the whole time, causing this sort of level of guilt. I don't want to give too much about it, but over time things start to unravel, and I don't think it's a spoiler because it says on the back of the book, the mother-in-law hasn't fully disappeared. She's still very much with them, and there's some ambiguity there. We sort of question whether Abby is a reliable narrator. There's an exploration around mental health, which I found interesting, her husband and his deterioration. So there's lots going on here, and again a really interesting grey character, but a good page turner, and one that yeah, found quite compulsive and quite odd, but I really enjoyed it. Really accessible. Yeah, definitely recommend that one as well if you like weird, dark gothic books. But this is set in contemporary times as well. There's no crumbling mansion, but there is a bit of a leaky house. So it's kind of got a nod to it. So definitely recommend Motherthing. And the last one I read, although I've not really talked about these in the order I read them, but this is one that I've had and I wanted to read for ages. And it's one that was published a few years ago now. I think it was published in 2007, but then first published in Spanish in 2021. And then it was copyrighted in 2007, and then it's been translated by Francis Riddle, and it's Claudio, Pineiro, Elena knows. And this is one that kept popping up again and again in people's best ofs last year, and I thought, I'm going to have to get around to reading this. I'm going to have to get around to reading it, and I actually really enjoyed it. It's not a huge read. It's again only about 140 odd pages. We're told the story through the eyes of Elena, although it's not first person narration, it's third person narration. And Elena has a lot going on. At the beginning of the novel, we learn that Elena's daughter ended her life, and it's been ruled as suicide, but Elena can't believe that that's true. So she kind of goes on a journey to try and prove that this isn't the case, and that her daughter wouldn't have ended her life, and it was clearly a murder. And the two characters have quite a difficult relationship when her daughter is alive, and it's complicated by further by the fact that Elena isn't at all well. She has MS, and it really impacts on her life and her being able to move around and get to places, and her tiredness, and in some ways it's as much about that aspect of her life than it is the death of her daughter. And it runs over a very short period of time, but it's full of really dense long paragraphs, and the dialogue is sort of reported, so it's sort of unusual in terms of its style, but that kind of slightly claustrophobic, don't let that description put you off, that slightly claustrophobic turn, a phrase, really links in with the challenges that Elena is experiencing. I did think as I was reading through the book, I know where this is going, but I didn't in the end. It was actually a different outcome than I was expecting. And it has real heart, and although it's sort of a stream of consciousness, we really buy into Eleanor and her life and the struggles that she's encountered. And I think it's just really beautifully written. It's full of heart, it's got a bit of a gut punch to it as well, but yeah, I definitely recommend it. And actually, you know, all that time I spent waiting to read it, I'm really glad that I did just pick it up and read it. You'll notice that I don't tend to do TBRs, you know, books that I intend to read in a particular month, because I'm a total mood reader. I like to just pick a book up on a whim and decide that that's what I'm going to read now. So apologies, I sort of talk about books that I've hauled, and then I often just go off on one in a completely different direction. And so that's what happens when I'm deciding what books I'm going to read in any given month. But hopefully I'll beat 4 for next month, 5 for next month, and I'll be able to share them with you earlier than, you know, the new year. So that'll be good. And I've got a few books that I've got that I'm really, really excited to read at the moment. I just need to settle on one. So I'm looking forward to sharing those with you as well. So I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on any of those books, whether there's anything that you think you might pick up, you might be interested in reading. But in the meantime, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye.